jungle.
Hello, you are listening to Trump Republic Radio. It is November 26, 2017. I'm your host, Enzo Quesada, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Bobby Hester.
Hello, everyone.
And this week, we're delaying the release on this, but we have back on a very good guest of ours, someone I consider a friend of mine, and that is Simon Roche of the Suidlanders.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Enzo and Robert. It's much appreciated.
So we talked to you back on June 1st, so many months ago. What have you been up to since then?
Well, we continued the tour of the USA through June, July, and August. Had some terrific, absolutely fantastic adventures. And came back to South Africa. By then I was exhausted. It's a bit like the Super Size Me documentary, you know, the guy who ate 30 days worth of McDonald's meals and landed in hospital.
Yeah.
Well, I ate 6 months of takeaway food, or fast food as you call it, and by the time I got back to South Africa I was broken. I took 2 whole months off on a remote farm in the middle of nowhere, shot a few springbok and tried to help in the drought. We've got a very bad drought in certain regions, and in the past 2 weeks I've just kind of gotten back into the groove, and we've got an American guest out here, the second one, who accepted our invitation to come and see for themselves, and I've been chaperoning and showing and what have you, so it was quiet for a while, but it's busy again now.
So, just in case anyone doesn't know what we're talking about, could you explain what Suidlanders is and what it does and why it's necessary?
Yeah. Enzo, Suidlanders is the world's largest non-state civil defense organization. And we are constituted under international law, particularly, but not only, particularly the Protocols 1 and 2 additional to the Geneva Conventions, which address the circumstances of civilians in conditions of armed conflict, whether it's international conflict or internal conflict, in other words, civil war. And in South Africa, over the past 23 years, since multiracial democracy, the African National Congress Party of Nelson Mandela has done a very, very good job of destroying much of the country. And with that has come quite a venomous, vicious attack on white South Africans. We foresee a civil war in this country, and it is being promised. Since I spoke to you, there have been a number of very exciting, scary things that have happened. Black leaders saying, right, boys, now we're going to kill all the whites. So our organization is constituted as a civil defense organization to protect the welfare, to safeguard the welfare of civilian non-combatants in this forthcoming civil war in South Africa.
And this is, as you said, something that you guys expect to happen. It's not just something that seems like a hypothetical.
Well, yes. You know, Enzo, one has to be cautious about discussing mystical and religious and faith-based things. So I'll be very brief and say that, you know, we believe in a series of prophecies that was given about 100 years ago that has been proven over and over and over again to be immaculately correct. Very explicit prophecies, the majority. Some of them vague and, you know, kind of typical, nobody understands them. But some of them absolutely explicit. And so those are an inspiration. And then on top of that comes the practical, almost sensory experience that we learn from every day. For example, in August of last year, 2016, our former judge president, the top of our judicial system, said that South Africa is staring a race-based civil war in the face, or similar words. In October of 2016, a very, very prominent black political analyst said, the first guy was black as well, just to be clear. This political analyst, who, by the way, is the brother of one of our former presidents, said, we are standing on the cusp of a race-based civil war. On the 7th of November last year, 2016, the leader of our Marxist party, very prominent party in South Africa, political party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, his name is Julius Malema, said in a speech outside the magistrates' courts of the town of Newcastle in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, I am not calling for the slaughter of all whites yet. As one very influential black traditional leader said to me, Simon, in English idiom, that could mean many things. Let me tell you, in African idiom, that means what we are hearing him say as black Africans. We know that what he's saying is that he is going to call for the slaughter of all whites and that his people should get ready. Now, since then, it has escalated. If I'm not mistaken, it was just about the time that we did a presentation for Thomas Kaiser in Dallas, Texas, a leader in the African National Congress's armed wing. So in other words, if the Republican Party is in power in the USA, it's in control of the army, but it also has its own private militia. So the African National Congress Party's armed wing, if you can even believe that this is possible, that the government can have its private armed wing, said, I am calling now for young blacks to go to training camps to train to fight whites in a civil war. Subsequent to that, there have been a number of others, I won't describe them all kind of ad nauseum, a number of other similar calls. So we have no reason not to believe that we are staring an armed conflict in the face.
And whites in South Africa are a minority class. They're only like, what, is it 5% of the population or so?
8.5%, yeah. About 1 in 12 people is white. About a similar number is the group that calls itself colored. They refuse to be known as blacks, and they are mixed race people. And a similar number is Indian, people from India who came here 120 or 130 years ago, and the balance are blacks. So about 8 or 9 out of 12 people would be black, and then 1 out of 12 white, 1 out of 12 Indian, 1 out of 12 colored.
Yeah, the demographics on it all is very interesting, and it plays into kind of the historical background, because I remember, because I went to your presentations both in Austin and New Braunfels, and, we went over, the Boer settlers coming into South Africa, and a lot of people wouldn't know this, but blacks aren't native to a lot of parts of South Africa. I mean, they came after a lot of whites came.
Well, look, South Africa as a whole was originally populated by the Aboriginal people. That is the scientific term for the very, very, very first people, who are, loosely speaking, the San and Khoi people, and 2 other groups, but loosely speaking, the San and Khoi people, who some people may know by the old politically incorrect names of Bushmen and Hottentots. The black people in South Africa now came from what is now Nigeria and Cameroon, so up in northwest Africa. They went eastwards right across Africa, and then they descended down through along the east coast of Africa. Now, when whites got here, about, loosely speaking, 50% of South Africa had been inhabited by those black people. They chased out the Aboriginals, and indeed, to this day, the Aboriginals' famous rock art, the famous Bushman rock art, exists in places where there are no Bushmen. The famous Bushman rock art does not exist where you find the remnants of the Bushmen today. They were chased from their historical homelands by the the black people. And so when whites arrived, about 50% of the country was occupied and had been occupied for any period of time by blacks, but about 50% had never been occupied by black people. All that were there were the Aboriginal, the small groups of hunter-gatherer people who had managed to survive the genocide, literal genocide that was perpetrated upon them by the blacks.
Yeah, people in the United States, they just think African is synonymous with black, but it isn't the case out there at all. But I wanted to kind of just paint the picture of the situation that is going on in South Africa right now, because most people in the United States just don't know. I was looking at the news yesterday, just kind of inundating myself on the things I wanted to talk to you about, and the S&P downgraded South Africa just yesterday to double B status, which is considered junk status. It's very low.
Yes, that's right. And we had a downgrade about 6 months ago, if I'm not mistaken. It was about the time that we were in Texas, from Fitch, by Fitch's, Moody's, and Standard & Poor. And now this is another downgrade. And you can't blame these people. You really can't blame them. These ratings agencies' job is to say, how sound is the economy? What makes sense? Now, we've recently had a budget speech given in which the numbers didn't add up. When your Minister of Finance can't do arithmetic, there's cause for concern.
Yeah. And, it also goes hand in hand with, the level of corruption that is out there in South Africa. I was looking over different things, and there was a report from the Auditors General of South Africa around June that said 2/3 of local authorities they have irregular allocations of your currency, which is the rand, of 41.7 billion rand. It's just they just have no idea where it's from.
Yeah, and that's on top, by the way, of an acknowledged loss or misappropriation. It's theft, really, but let's use the politically correct words, of 700 billion prior to that. This is the latest one.
Yeah.
This is what they can't find today, And
it makes you wonder, where does all this money even go, though?
Well, it goes into the pockets of private individuals who are connected to the state. It goes back to this phenomenon that black Africans speak about. This is not a racist white person making, using nasty words. The big man. We need the big man. That's what we believe in. Democracy is for other people. We want a big, powerful man who can beat everybody up. And hopefully, if we're nice to him, he'll be nice to us. And so what they call patronage, where, let's say I'm the president of the country, there's a system of patronage that filters down from me through the cabinet ministers into the directors general of the departments of the government, into the management of the departments of the government, and all the way along, somebody's taking a cut. And it's that's the way you do it.
So in South Africa, you have a situation where your economy is tanking. It's doing very poorly. The government is extremely corrupt. And then on top of that, you have South Africa is one of the worst murder rates in the world.
Yeah. It's 2.02 times. This, by the way, is a figure that has been admitted into the records of our parliament, not something we made up. 2.02 times more dangerous to be a white farmer in South Africa than it is to be a policeman in one of the world's most violent societies, South Africa. There's something wrong when you stand double the chance of being murdered for tilling the soil as you do for fighting crime on the mean streets of Johannesburg or in the townships.
I think it was last time we talked, you said it, to imagine it to American murder rates, to be a South African white farmer is something like 13.7 times the murder rate, I believe you said.
Yeah, let me see if I hope you don't mind, but I'll just reach beyond the screen and pick up the book and I'll give you the exact statistic.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Excuse me doing that. I'll read to you verbatim the information that was compiled by a guy in Salina, Ohio, a mechanical engineer. And what he did was he got a hold of us and he offered to help with statistics. So he went to all the original sources and he worked this out himself. He then presented it to us, and we double-checked it about 3 times, or we checked it about 3 times. Well, it was 3 times. We subsequently sent it to a large American organization to verify it. And they said, well, it all makes sense. It's arithmetic and all the original sources are there. So here we go. A white South African of any age, any gender, either gender, a 3-year-old little girl, stands 0.44, half almost, the chance of being murdered as a Vietnam War active duty soldier ever stood of dying. So an American soldier in Vietnam, he's got a certain chance of dying. You would think it's pretty high. I mean, this is war after all. It's almost half as dangerous to be a living, breathing 3-year-old white South African girl. The chances of a white South African being murdered by a black person are 24,970% greater than a black person in the USA ever stood of being lynched during the time of the lynchings, the famous lynchings. 24,970% greater chance of a white South African being killed than a black American ever stood of being lynched. A white South African stands 1,370% greater chance of being murdered in their lifespan than any American stands of being murdered in their lifespan. Not 13% more, not 130% more, 1,370% greater chance.
It's all just crazy numbers. They're so large, it seems like it's fake, you know? But, like, I understand that it's real. It's just not something I can even imagine as someone that just lives in Texas, that level of violence.
Yeah. It's a level that people can't comprehend, and that's what precipitated Black Monday, you know. Whites have been told for a long, long time that anything that they believe which is inconsistent with the prevalent narrative of the new South African Rainbow Nation, so anything that is not overtly liberal, not overtly pro-Nelson Mandela, pro-ANC, pro everything that you can imagine, anything that is inconsistent with that is wrong, bad, and unacceptable, intolerable. And so whites have been kind of browbeaten into submission as these levels of murders have occurred on the farms and not on the farms. You know, it's the just general whites as well. And they've kind of held their peace. But eventually, it's like kind of a boil or something. You know, eventually the head pops. It has to in the end. And that's what happened with Black Monday.
And that was on October 30th, so very recently. Could you tell us what happened on that day?
There had been a spate of very gruesome murders and attacks. I beg your pardon. And in one attack, an old man and woman were tied up, husband and wife, elderly, in their 70s. I think one of them may have been in their 80s. Tied up and had boiling oil and boiling water poured over them. In another attack, the farmer was stabbed with a pitchfork while he was, he'd been beaten down by 4 guys, elderly guy, 56 or something like that. Stabbed with this pitchfork repeatedly. And when he was lying there kind of helpless, they then burned him to death. Another farmer was put in his truck, trussed up, truck locked, and then the truck was set alight. So he was burned alive in his own truck. So these things kind of got to people to the point where a guy on the preceding Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, spontaneously said, hey, we've got to do something on Monday. We're all going to wear black shirts and we're going to do this and we're going to do that and we're going to, we're going to make our voices heard. And everybody chipped in, absolutely everybody. Well, apart from the liberals in the cities, but the majority of white conservatives who are in the non-liberal heartlands of the country participated. And many ordinary people just wore a black shirt to work, and said, oh, accidental. I know nothing about Black Monday. Terrible, racists. It's accidental. But the net result was that you had tens and tens of thousands of people across South Africa wearing black. I went into the shops, the stores, that afternoon, and every second person was wearing black. It was the most inspiring thing.
And I know it shut down like a lot of highways throughout the country as well, didn't it?
Yeah, yes, that was deliberate. If the protests had been held in random locations, nobody would have paid any attention to them. So the Black Monday protesters took a leaf out of the book of the black protesters in South Africa. Generally, they shut down freeways, put burning tires, this, that, the next thing. And they shut down these freeways, particularly interchange nodes, where two freeways cross or a big bridge runs over a freeway, that kind of thing. So they inconvenience people, and the world had to take notice, excuse me. One thing you may find interesting is that a number of black people complained afterwards that institutionalized racism was still entrenched in the fabric of South African society because the police did not go and monitor the protests. And of course, there's a reason why. There's a simple reason. When the liberal black forces have protested over the past, say, 40 years, they've always destroyed something. Break, burn, damage. And if you go onto the Suidlanders website, Suidlanders.org, Suidlanders.org, people can see for themselves the nature of these protests typically. But the police kind of knew. It's a bunch of whiteys. They're not going to break anything. It's not their way, Yeah.
And you couldn't afford to break or anything. You couldn't afford to burn anything. Otherwise, the damnation y'all would receive would be 10 times, worse.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes. So we did it the old-fashioned way, the way that's kind of consistent with our cultural heritage and norms. You don't build something and then just break it. It just doesn't make sense. But I'll tell you an interesting story, Robert and Enzo. About 15 years ago, I was working on a big project. I spent many years in the live event industry, concerts, shows, opening ceremonies, whatever you like. And I was working on a big project, and I had to reconnoiter a certain venue. And I went with a black guy who, at the time, was a pretty senior person in our national broadcaster. We have a national broadcaster like they do in Britain. They have the BBC. We have the SABC. And so we drove in his car. And with the top down, it was very nice, lovely day, speeding along the freeways with the wind in our hair, having a lovely conversation. And we got onto the topic of whatever it was, and he turned to me and he said, we black people we don't have what is known as constructive anger. And I said to him, what are you talking about? He said, constructive anger is when the USA bombs Japan, and Japan, instead of feeling sorry for itself, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they pick themselves up out of the ashes and they try to do better than they did before. He said, in our culture, and he said, you can witness this anywhere in the world, he said it's an instinctive thing amongst black people. When we're angry, we never turn it into good. We get destructive. So we don't have constructive anger. We always have destructive anger. And this is an interesting anecdote because this thing was told to me by a black guy. Not just a black guy, but a black guy who was an apparatchik in our national broadcaster. I said to him, you can't say things like that. You'll land both of us in jail. And he said, well, it's just true. Whether you like it or not, it's absolutely true.
It's really crazy stuff. We mentioned before we want to talk about the Spur Steak Ranches boycott that happened a bit back. You were surprised that I even knew about that, but I guess you could explain it better than I can, but...
Well, very simply, there was an altercation in we have a chain of restaurants, kind of...
it's like American style, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing. The whole thing is American themed, but this chain is a bit like Olive Garden. If you're trying to work out kind of what level it's at, it's not fast food. Sit down, decent food, and it's themed. It's American. Like the motif is a secret tribe of Red Indians, and they cook their food in a special way, and they're hidden in some mountains in goodness knows where, Arizona or somewhere. Anyway, so it's aping American culture. Anyway, there was an altercation between a conservative, right-wing, or so he seemed to be in demeanor, Afrikaner, and a black woman whose child was behaving badly in the restaurant. Now, the thing that provoked people's anger was, obviously many people watched the video. It was filmed on somebody's telephone. And many people took sides. The whites are right, the blacks are right. No, how can the white man speak to the black girl like that? How can the black woman use such foul language? That was a natural division. But what really, really, really got to conservative whites was the way that the restaurant chain handled the matter. They handled it in a spirit of absolute political correctness. We don't tolerate such things. They completely overlooked the practical facts of the events that occurred.
They banned the guy from the restaurant.
Right. So, conservative whites said, right, in that case, we won't eat at Spur anymore. Now, I told you that I returned here on the 3rd of September from the USA. And I went almost immediately to recuperate. I was very unwell on a remote farm in a rural district of South Africa. And I got to know the farmers' buddies, the other farmers around. And I learned, to my absolute astonishment, that the boycott of Spur by white conservatives has led to a plummet in the price of potatoes. Because this chain is so big that the amount of custom that they've lost has led to them ordering fewer potatoes for French fries, and therefore farmers have less demand for the potatoes they grow, which has led to farmers stopping growing potatoes. Not all farmers, obviously you can buy potatoes, but many farmers find it no longer worthwhile. And this is something that is so powerful. It's so powerful for you guys in the USA, for us here. As I said to you, there's an American with me now. He's in the next room, staying in my house with me. He's been out here for a week. We've done all sorts of interesting things. And he keeps on making this comment. Wow, you're doing what we're talking about. And he's not being unpatriotic. There's a reason for it. We're in a different circumstance to you guys. So at some point, we've had to wake up and put our money where our mouth is, and take direct action. That will come in the USA with time, but I'd like to encourage you guys to know that this really is possible. If between, and I'm just going to mention random names here, I don't know the USA and the USA right wing like you guys do. So I'll just give you my kind of favorite examples from the people we met in the USA. If IE and let's say the League of the South and the American Freedom Party, for argument's sake, random examples, and Matthew Heimbach's people, TWP, if they all said, look, let's not use Google search engines because Google is so liberal, because they've done so much damage to the right wing, because they're so pro-lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender, queer, whatever, all these funny names. Let's use Bing. Not because Bing is perfect, but because Bing is not overtly opposed to our value system. Or let's use DuckDuckGo. Or let's use Startpage as our search engine. You would create a kind of a spirit, a geist between you guys that would strengthen you to the power of 10 compared to the strength that you have now.
Yeah, it would. There were some other things that I wanted to ask you about, just since you're South African and I don't really know much about. Could you tell us about Orania? Because I know it's a very controversial thing. A lot of people get mad that it exists.
Yeah, they're competing versions. I'm going to tell you the one that I believe to be correct and which I know to be correct because I know the right people to know the true story. Prior to the elections of 1994, on the 27th of April, which were won by the African National Congress, and out of which Nelson Mandela assumed the reins of power as the president of South Africa. Prior to that, a hardcore group of Afrikaners, Boers, as the really conservative traditional Afrikaners are called, made it clear that under no circumstances would they tolerate this abomination to go ahead. In order to appease them, the white government and the soon-to-be black government, everybody knew that the African National Congress was going to win, agreed to create a little enclave so that these people could live in apartheid forever. They would never have to deal with blacks. And it's a little enclave on the Orange River. Now, I took this American guest there the other day, and they were just blown away. They loved it. Not in the spirit of hatred or racism, but in the spirit of solidarity, seeing people work together. And this guy said to me as we were driving in my car, wow, man, I'm going to tell everybody in America they've got to come and see this. It's middle class. There's nothing fancy about it. You might even describe it as lower middle class. Simple. Nothing fancy at all, but clean, neat, tidy, decent, respectable, old-fashioned, polite, courteous. It is everything that your grandparents experienced growing up in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the USA. Simple, old-fashioned values. Courtesy, hospitality, friendliness. It really works well in its own small, humble way.
Yeah, I think it's really crazy that, like, you know, like they want to say, like, white people are so oppressive, but then when they, you know, decide, like, oh, well, then we'll just all leave you alone, we'll just have our own little place, like, they get up in arms about that. Like, like they're not even harming anyone, they're just keeping to themselves.
Yes. And now they've taken it a step further. These guys, there's such a thorn in the side of the African National Congress. You can imagine the African National Congress has hated, detested for the past 23 years that it ever conceded to this thing, you know, or acceded to it. You know, that in this new South African rainbow nation, there could still be this apartheid enclave. But these guys have taken it one step further. They've made their own money. You know, which is an illegal thing to do. You, Enzo, and you, Robert, can't say, hey, you know, guys, we've got a new, well, how could we put it together? ROEN. We've got a new Roan currency. The new Roan currency, the Robert and Enzo currency, that's what we're all going to be using now, or NRO, whatever. That's illegal. You can't do that. Can't do that in any country of the world. And these guys have just said, you know, I nearly used a dirty word, but you know, we don't care. We're gonna do it. And they're doing it successfully.
Yeah, and I think it kind of like sticks a point to them because, you know, it's not like a corrupt place like a lot of South Africa, and it just doesn't experience like a lot of the, you know, disorder that's going on currently.
Yeah. Look, it has its problems, and if you speak to insiders, they'll give you long stories about how, you know, it's been taken over by Freemasons and this and that and the next thing. But comparatively speaking, you know, you just can't compare it. Even if you say, well, it's less than perfect, it's still 100,000 times better than being raped by 3 men on a Sunday morning in Johannesburg before breakfast.
Yeah. And, you know, especially when you look at, like, you know, the victimization of whites in South Africa, you think it would be okay that they could have a place where they wouldn't be subject to this, but I don't know. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask you about another group, and that is the Black First, Land First group.
Oh, yes.
I don't think people... Like, they don't even know that this is, like, a political organization in the United States. It sounds so audacious, but I guess it exists.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's got terrific support, old Andile. It's, you know, it's so easy. It's so easy to exploit fallacies. And that's what these guys are doing. All South Africans stole all black people's land. All white South Africans, I beg your pardon, and we want it all back. But it's a fiction. You know, it's a fiction, not least because the land occupied by black people, as you and I know black people, as opposed to the dainty, fragile, little Aboriginal people, the Bushmen and Hottentots, to use the incorrect term, but the term that many people might recognize. All of that land belonged to the Aboriginal people. All of the land. The Aboriginal people were chased off it, and the blacks occupied it. Well, not chased off it, they were murdered, they were killed. It was a phenomenal genocide. And then, in the famous Mfecane Wars of the early 1800s, between 1/3 and 2/3 of all of the black people of South Africa died in a series of civil wars over the occupation of their land. In other words, I'm making the point that if you go to the history books and you look at the casualty rate of World War I, World War II, the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Roses, and so on and so forth, you'll find that the casualty rate is limited to about between 10 and 20% of the combatants, and then very small numbers of civilians. We're talking about 1 to 2/3 from liberal sources only. 1 to 2/3 of every man, woman, and child, every black human being in South Africa were killed in those wars. So when you talk about conquest and land, unless you know your facts, you're bound to be misled. And that's what this guy's doing. He's misleading his audience. He's telling black people, hey, these whites, just look how nicely they live. And they're doing it on your land. If they hadn't come here, you would have that big farmhouse. We can do just as they can. Why not? You would have those 3 Ford trucks and those 6 tractors. That could all be yours. We've got to take it back. He can't lose. He has fantastically large support.
And it's just like they hold rallies for this, you know, organization, and they're like very like violent, fervorous rallies. I remember you were showing us some photos of it at the presentations you were giving. Like they would come around with like like white baby dolls on like poles, and like people would hit them, and like just like the visceral image of that really speaks to what they want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you imagine how far you would get if you guys, the two of you, decided to get a black Barbie doll and march down the streets of New Braunfels and invite, any kind of right-wing whites to smack it over the head? It would be on the front page of every newspaper in the world. It would be on BBC, CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS. The reportage would be incessant.
People would seek us out and kill us if we tried to do anything similar.
At the very least, would be thrown out of polite society, would never get a job, wouldn't be able to do anything the rest of our lives.
Absolutely. One of the guys who went to Charlottesville with me, I ended up going to Charlottesville as an observer. But I was with a certain gang of people. Excuse me, and I traveled with 5 other guys, 1, 2, 3, 4 other people. And one of the guys in our vehicle lost his job, just for being at a rally.
Yeah. Well, I guess since you bring that up, that is like a very contentious thing here in the United States, that what happened in Charlottesville. I guess if you wanted, you could tell us what you saw, what went down. Because we haven't really talked to many people that went.
Yeah, Enzo, we could do another show in which I could get my facts straight again, as I have done in other interviews, where I've ensured that everything that I've said was precise, accurate, and correct in terms of, date, time, place, who said what to whom. But I can say this off the cuff. I have not seen one single truthful report on Charlottesville.
No.
The reality is that everything that they're saying is a lie. It's a categorical lie. And I can substantiate that claim quite nicely. I've done interviews with a couple of other people where I've said, look, just listen to this argument and then tell me for yourself whether it makes sense. Where the people came from, what direction they walked in, what occurred first, what occurred second, where the police were standing, where the state troopers were standing, where the county sheriff's people were standing. And none of that has ever been disputed. There are people who kind of look after my best interest, people in the USA, supporters, very kind, gentle people, and I don't follow myself, and I never get involved in domestic American politics, so I don't go onto IE's boards and that kind of thing and get into disputes. But there are people who let me know if there's anything happening, and people say, look, nobody has disputed your facts, and it's because they're indisputable. The simple fact of the matter is that the whole story is a lie from beginning to end, the whole entire thing. And you will appreciate that if you appreciate from the beginning what occurred, little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit, and you observe the times. And if you take note of the police announcements, what they said, and when they said it, and to whom they said it, it's a fiction. The whole thing is a fiction.
And, like, people lost their mind when, President Donald Trump said there was violence on both sides. I mean, that's just an objective thing. But you can't lay any blame.
It's not objective, it's false. There was no violence on both sides. They attacked us. End of story.
Yeah.
Man, I'm telling you, I was there. I was standing next to Dr. Michael Hill when they assaulted him. I was standing next to the guys who had the first punches thrown at them and the kicks. It was by a big, I don't know if she's, I don't want to use the wrong word, an Amazon woman, a big, strong woman, looked like a Russian pole vaulter. I was there, I saw it. There was no violence from our people. It was not our people who threw any punches. It was not our people who moved forward off that park. It didn't happen. Categorically, I'm telling you, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
They created a barricade at the bottom of the steps. These guys came to them and they defended that point. I'm sorry to get so hot under the collar, but it's enough to make me explode with frustration, because this is how our people have been, put under the thumb of the global elites over the past 60, 70, 80, 100 years. Through fantastic lies, complete lies. It's like the Bundy story, what's his name, Cleveton Bundy and his kids. When you examine it a little bit closely, It's all made up. This thing that happened in the USA. And I beg your pardon for flying off the handle like that. But even Donald Trump wasn't being truthful, because when he says there was violence on both sides, it implies that both sides were responsible for the violence. If you and I had a punch-up, let's say you walked up to me in a bar, and for whatever reason, you threw a punch at me, and I defended myself and eventually punched you. If somebody later said, well, there were punches thrown from both sides, it gives the impression that we were both equally wrong. And that's false. The fact is that you walked up to me in the bar, done nothing wrong to you, you walked up to me and threw a punch. The delicate choice of words is completely misleading. The reality is that the right-wingers did not instigate any of that violence whatsoever. They never moved off that, what we would call a pavement, you would call a curbside, I think, at the bottom of the steps. Yes, they threw punches after they'd been attacked, after they had the pepper. We were all pepper sprayed and maced, and people, I don't know these things. People tell me this one is bear spray, that one's pepper spray, that one's mace. I have no idea. Not one single antagonistic, instigatory punch was thrown by the right wing. It's as simple as that. Forgive me for getting so upset, but this is enough.
Oh, no, yeah. No, it's justified, though, because, like, you know, and people can disagree with what they were doing all day, but they didn't have any intention of causing violence. You know, they had a permit, and they, you know, coordinated with the police everything they wanted to do that day. They're supposed to allow them to get vehicles up to the park, but everything that was planned the night before was just thrown out the window. And, you know, the ACLU upheld their case in court, and they still have free speech. Even if you think that these people are evil, racist, you know, Nazis, they're still allowed to do this. And they did everything that they're supposed to do. And because they get attacked and have to defend themselves, all of a sudden all of the onus is on them. And just the thing that's crazy about it is just like, you know, you don't need to take the news's word for it. There's so many live streams of people that were recording there that day. If you just watch it yourself, you can tell what happened.
Yes, yes. I can state to you categorically, on oath, my oath as a Christian man, that the right-wingers did not at any point in time move off that pavement. In other words, they did not conduct an attack, an assault. They did not launch anything against any, at all, without exception, of those Antifa people. They stood in one place and moved backwards and forwards a couple of yards at a time, from the base of the steps to the edge of the curb. The steps, the curb, the steps, the curb. Occasionally a couple of people would, you know, get carried away in the melee, and they would go 2 paces off the curb, and then they would come back to that point. But at no point did that phalanx, that shield wall, surge forward, because if it had, it would have gone 50 yards before it was stopped. It was like a Roman testudo. That's how it is that the Antifa didn't manage to get onto the grassy patch itself, the park itself. It's because those youngsters, and they were young, men, let me tell you that day I saw men with my own eyes, 20, 21, 22, 23, as skinny as a toothpick, but they stood firm like men. If they had wanted to be antagonistic and give Antifa as good as they were getting from Antifa, naturally it's the nature of physical force. They would have gone 40 yards down the road before anybody had stopped them. But they didn't even go off that pavement, that curbside, which is indicative of the fact that they were defensive only.
Yeah. And, you know, they portrayed it in a way to where their violence is speech. And, you know, the speech of the people that were being attacked is violence, and it justifies them being attacked. We had American politicians say that, you know, I know Marco Rubio said that they were justified to be attacked for what they were saying. And this is an elected American official saying that.
this is the
A Republican. He's supposed to be right wing, and he's against freedom of speech.
This goes to this thing of the fallacy of cumulative wisdom. The fallacy of cumulative wisdom is that we must be cleverer than our parents. We must be. They're a bunch of idiots. Look at us. We've got smartphones. We know everything. And so it is that our generation believes that the values we hold now are right and anything that came before is wrong. The implication is that our parents, our forebears, our forefathers were stupid. They got it all wrong. We've got all the answers. It's the other way around. It's the other way around. They were the practitioners of common sense. They were the adherents to the natural laws at a time when the laws of nature or the natural laws meant a very specific thing. They were the wise, sensible people who had the most to lose if they did something reckless or stupid. It was at a time when you had to conduct your life in a sane, sober, sensible fashion. Otherwise, your farm would fail, your crops would fail, you would lose your job. Our generation gets away with murder. We can do anything. We go to a hospital, they'll give us a new heart, take as many drugs as we like, we do this, do that. We have very little consequences to our decisions and behavior. And therefore, we can be foolish. The simple reality is that Marco Rubio and these people have gotten it into their heads that it's good to get rid of all Confederate identity, all Southern identity and culture and texture, all the noble and good and pure that the South cherished for so long, because they know everything. And all the generations of Southerners who cherish these things so close to their hearts are a bunch of idiots. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
And it's like a strange thing that like I'm not from the South personally. I'm from Wisconsin, the heart of the North. During the Civil War, Wisconsin, we killed tons of Confederate soldiers. But I never had a problem with people from the South still cherishing their Confederate lineage, because the people that were fighting, 99% of the whites in the Confederacy didn't even hold slaves at its peak of slaveholding. The people that fought didn't have slaves at all. And in the Union, we had slave states fighting for us. It wasn't so cut and dry that they make it out to be.
Yeah, in the Union, 3 of the states were slave states. Is that in the Lincoln movie?
No.
Do children get taught that at school? Are children taught that there are records in black and white, records of Abraham Lincoln negotiating with the American Missionary Society to take all of the blacks in the USA back to Africa? You've caught me on the wrong day. I don't know why I'm so hot under the collar today.
Oh, it's good though.
Really,
it's
the
good.
Stuff it's enough to make you. I don't know, man.
I just, it is what you're saying, the cumulative knowledge fallacy, and it's something I know personally. And it's just, who are we to say that we're so much smarter than people that survived through such harder times than us? And it's something else.
It is something else. And the thing is that you're never going to overcome it.
Oh, did we just lose you, Simon?
I think we lost him.
The last thing that we're talking about is just, people thinking that because, knowledge from the past is from the past, it's wrong. But, while we were down with technical difficulties, I was thinking about it. And the thing is, in the past, it was a normal thing to, cherish and honor your heritage and actually have a connection to it. And, for the longest eons of history, and this is still a way people think, for the majority of the world, that it's a normal, healthy thing to have a connection to your heritage. But now we live in an age where, certain people aren't allowed to have that connection to their heritage. And, we're talking about...
Certain people.
Yeah, we're talking about the things that happened in Charlottesville and, and how we're trying to, like, delegitimize, like, people having connection to their Confederate, heritage. If we want to look at other people around the world that have done bad things, we don't have the same standard to them. They always talk about slavery and how the United States is, like, uniquely bad for what we've done. The Middle East had way more slaves than the United States ever did. The slave trade from Africa to the Middle East was much larger. The reason we don't talk about it is they castrated their slaves, so they never reproduced. That's why there's no black people in the Middle East today.
Correct. That is scientifically correct. You're speaking absolute facts. And it's heartbreaking to see how Americans, ordinary Americans, take responsibility for slavery when really it's kind of like if the three of us each committed a crime and I stole an apple, old Robert here committed, some, God forbid, but, assault and Enzo was guilty of murder. And then I've spent the rest of my life kind of saying to the little village that the three of us live in, well, I'm ever so sorry about that day that I stole the apple. I mean, it's just crazy.
And, we're talking with, like, the black first, land first group, fallacy is, like, my family weren't even around during the Civil War, but, like, because I'm white, we're still blamed for slavery as a collective, even though, like, it isn't a part of my people's history. Like,
yes.
I know, Bobby, you have family that was around during the Civil War, but they weren't slaveholders, were they?
Well, what I've learned is that if you can trace your family history back, if your family was wealthy, they probably did own slaves, versus if you say, hey, my family didn't own slaves, that means they were probably pretty poor. All I can say is that my family has been fairly well off throughout history, so...
They potentially had. You don't know if they did or not.
We know for a fact that at least one person did, but I don't think it was widespread throughout our family's history.
Yeah.
But for a fact, at least one, so I could say, yeah, probably.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, why would you today still be the bearer of, like, the misdeeds of someone generations ago? That's not... It's strange, but, like, I don't know. Do you have thoughts on this stuff, Simon, though? You're the one that we did bring on to talk about it.
Well, no, I do have thoughts on it. I feel very strongly about this thing because fundamentally it's false for white America as a whole to take responsibility for something in which very few people participated, but even more to the point, to take responsibility for something which somebody else did on a far grander scale. It's absolutely absurd. And thirdly, to take responsibility for perpetrating something which the victims of did worse. And what I mean by that is this. Who's worse? Your daughter, who, God forbid, becomes a cocaine addict, or the cocaine merchant? The users of slaves, to my way of thinking, are nowhere near the. I'm not saying it's great to be a slave, but the user of the slave owner, to my way of thinking, is nowhere near as reprehensible as the people who captured the slaves, which were black Africans.
Yeah.
Or the people who enslaved them, which is Tipu Tib and company, who are Muslims. And the Muslims bought those slaves. There were no great white slaving expeditions into the USA. There wasn't some guy called Billy Bob Johnson from Georgia who went across to Africa and grabbed a whole lot of slaves and came back on a boat. The black Africans captured one another in their traditional tribal wars and then sold them to the Muslim slave traders, who then took them to the slave trading ports of Sofala and Zanzibar and Dar es Salaam and so on. Now, those Muslims did it on the basis of what they call kafir. Kafir means somebody whose faith is irredeemable. It's often translated as infidel, but it's not really. It means kafir can only apply to blacks and Hindus and people like that. In the Islamic way of looking at things, Jews are infidels. Christians are infidels. But the kafir, the Hindu,
is worse.
Who doesn't believe in one God, but believes in a panoply of gods, and the blacks, who are either animist, meaning that they believe in spirits in inanimate objects, so they give life to dead things. So there's a spirit in a tree or whatever, or a rock or what have you. Or atavist, which means that they believe in their ancestors. Those are kafir. And that was the basis on which the Muslims engaged in that trade. They, religiously speaking, didn't feel any obligation to treat those people as human beings, as they might have treated Jews or Christians. They believed that they were perfectly entitled to treat the blacks as kafir. So when you consider all of that, when you weigh it all up, you begin to think to yourself, how is it that I, as the little boy in grade, 10, who saw the kid throw the stone at the window, the headmaster's window, am somehow more responsible for the damage than the guy who threw the stone? It just doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. And, looking at our situation currently in the United States, like, we're dealing with a lot of calls for the removal of Confederate statues. We've already seen a lot. Here in Texas, especially, we saw them take down statues at UT, in the capital of Austin. And, there were similar things happening in South Africa when apartheid ended. They were taking down statues of Cecil Rhodes, weren't they?
Well, that's actually far more recent, but yes, the principle is absolutely correct. It occurred 2 years ago.
Oh, yeah. I know that they're doing similar things, though.
Yes. Yeah, the principle is 100% valid. The reality is this, that somebody, and different people say different things, and I don't really want to get into cruel judgments of other people. It's not my way, and it's not the Suidlanders' way. And indeed, this American visitor that I told you about, who's been with us for the past week, had dinner with our leader, Gustav Müller, about 4 or 5 nights ago. And I was fortunate to be there. And I listened to Gustav address this exact subject. And I'll tell you what, he gave the best explanation that I've ever heard in my whole life of why we should be cautious of blaming other people for our problems. A very well substantiated argument. The point that I'd like to come to, though, is that the dramatic change in the values of our culture over the past, give it a number, 70, 100 years, has been largely imposed upon us. It has been from the exterior. The most of the changes in our culture, in our what is called in legal terms norms, mores, and values, everything that distinguishes and characterizes a culture or a society or a civilization, have not erupted from within. It hasn't been from within the typical American culture that people have said, hey, gee, we should really tear down our statues, we should really become more self-recriminating, we should abandon Roy Rogers and everything else that we've kind of held sacrosanct throughout the period of our civilization. It's from outside. It's external elites who say, you're bad, you're wrong. And they kind of worm their way into the heart of the culture and corrode it from within.
Yeah. And, and Donald Trump has talked about this as well. Like, it doesn't end with Confederate statues here in the United States, and we've already seen it. You know, there was that church, what was it, that George Washington church, Bobby, where they removed, like, the plaque honoring, like, George Washington because he held slaves, and it would be intimidating for people.
Where is it going to end? Benjamin Franklin, I'm sure that they can find something wrong with him. Thomas Jefferson, it's only a matter of time before they find something wrong with him too. It will never, ever, ever end. Their goal and objective is to ruin your culture. By now, this must be clear. If you can't see this with, and I say this with respect, please don't take me the wrong way.
Yeah.
But if you can't see this by now, the problem is with you, not with the evidence. Because there is no shortage of evidence for the argument, the allegation, that there is an external force which is assaulting European-derived, Christian-based societies around the world. This assault on norms, mores, and values, on cultures, on civilizations, and on societies is not happening in Vietnam. All the headlines about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, abortion, how bad parents are and how children are victims and women this and the next thing. Man, those headlines are not about what's going on in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It's about how evil Robert Hester and Enzo Quesada are. It's about your culture, your values, your family, the things that you cherish and hold dear. And unless you guys, with respect, again, unless you guys get it into your thick skulls, and I don't really mean to be arrogant and brash, but there's a time for being blunt. Unless you guys get it into your thick skulls, as we have to get it into our thick skulls here, that unless we stand together, we are doomed, you might as well not even try. Because unless we embargo the companies and the businesses and the politicians and the media and the academic elites who are opposed to our values, we fundamentally sponsor our own strangulation. If, let's say, Colgate toothpaste, tomorrow launched a new lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, I don't know all the words, campaign, and you continued buying Colgate, you would be directly responsible for strangling to death the fire of your culture and your identity, your race, your genes, because they are suppressing your genetic instincts. Obviously, this is obvious, in your own children. You would be responsible for your children ending up rotten, characterless, anodyne.
Yeah. And, when we were talking in Austin, when we were at the one beer place we were talking, I remember you said to me, like, you see the warning signs of trouble in the United States similar to that what you've seen in South Africa. And,
yes,
it's not a warm thing to say, like, oh, American society is slowly crumbling, but, like, I think most people in the country do feel it. Like, we are at a level of divisiveness that, like, people haven't experienced this before, and there's polling that shows this as well. And just, I think it's time that we all acknowledge that this is going on, at least, if we want to fix things.
I was trying to make the point earlier, and I might have digressed, but you're never going to fix everybody. I know that's not what you said.
Yeah.
But I'm tacking on to what you said. You're never going to fix everybody, and you're never going to get everybody on your side. And unfortunately, there is a tendency amongst Americans to believe that if they argue their case well enough for long enough, that they will persuade people. Everybody's got common sense. Everybody's inherently good, or they're not stupid. But it's never going to be the case. What you have to focus on is an introspection within the people who already share your values. And to say, right, guys, we have to stand together or we're going to be destroyed. Yeah, if you are successful, people will be attracted to you and they will join you. But if all you do is look outwards and hope that you can convert every abortion doctor in New York City, you're crazy. It's never going to happen. You've got to start recognizing that the people around you are, as Christ said, your nearest. As a woman said to me the other day, we don't have to debate the parable of the Good Samaritan. One word says it all. Nearest. Neighbor is just an English translation. It's meaningless. Just ignore it. Nearest implies that they are furthest, or at least further. And you have to, like the Good Samaritan, look to those who are closest to you and care about them and understand that it is only they who care about you too. You have to build these high trust relationships and stand together through thick and thin for life or death. Or you don't stand a chance, because they, as we know from communism and many other faiths, for want of a better word, ideologies, doctrines, concepts even, human concepts, they are willing to pay any price with other people's blood. Any price.
Yeah. Bobby, do you have some thoughts on this stuff that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually wanting to say something back when we were talking about slavery earlier that I just thought of. You know, as much as people like to bring that up as the issue, is why they want to like remove Confederate statues and whatnot here in the United States. What a lot of people forget is that if you look, you know, they have maps and data and statistics on this. If you look at where most slaves were brought out of Africa into, you know, the New World, only like less than 5% of it went to the United States, and even less went to Mexico. Almost all of it, something like over half, went to South America.
Yeah.
And so, you know, obviously there's problems down there, but they like to make it seem like it was only the United States and it was extremely terrible here, when, you know, conditions were much, much worse down in South Africa, or not, I'm sorry, not South Africa, South America, especially when they had people working in like mines and stuff. But that's just what I wanted to
because they can use it as a tool against us. If they can, you know, if they can dishearten us or disenfranchise us or get us to willingly, you know, hand over our country to them, you know, these cultural Marxists that want to change our country, you know, they'll use anything that they can. They don't have these kind of discussions in South America. They don't have these issues. It's just, it's a mind game that they use against us. Because we've had a successful country, our success is our, you know, debt to the rest of the world, apparently.
Well, I don't think that they want to destroy your country necessarily. If they could...
They want control of it, though.
That's it. And the way to gain control of it is to destroy the people. That's the thing. They are endeavoring to destroy your value set, your norms, mores, and values, so that they can provide you with a substitute solution, which is this internet nationalist phenomenon, you know, the New World Order and things related to it. There's some terrific reading to be done on this subject, and I encourage people who may be listening to this broadcast thinking, well, do they really know what they're talking about? Is there a New World Order? Oh, gee, maybe. Go and do the reading. You will be astonished at the wealth of evidence, the overwhelming preponderance of evidence that indicates that there is most certainly something that can be called a conspiracy to subvert the European Christian tradition.
Yeah. And we're seeing it even worse in Europe right now. You know, like I have family that lives in Sweden. And, Just this week they abolished, in a sense, the nationhood of Sweden. They wanted to get rid of the sense that they, eliminate the existence of even having borders for the nation. They just want Sweden to be a nation of immigrants. And, it never has been that way. And Sweden doesn't bear the supposed sins of our forefathers as Americans. Sweden is, one of the most neutral countries that have ever existed. It's just like, you don't have to be a slave-holding state to have the same kind of sins applied to you.
Yeah. Well, it's everything. It's everything it's all of the characteristics of our culture. They must be destroyed in the minds of our opponents. And you can see that assault, what I'm saying is not something that I just sucked out of my thumb. You only have to look at the nature of the assault on our culture to perceive that every aspect and facet of the culture is a threat. They're not only attacking our religion, not only attacking us as a homogeneous race, not only attacking our birth rate. It's all of it. And I don't know. I don't think that we stand much chance unless we stand together. We are going to have to stand together at our own cost. That is the key thing. Since I was in the USA, both during the 6-month period and in the almost 3 months that I've been back, I've received countless emails from people saying, why don't you just leave? Imagine if at tour in 732 under Charles Martel, those guys had said, well, instead of opposing the Muslim invasion, why don't we just leave? Then nobody will die, nobody will get hurt. Imagine if in 1529 Jan III Sobieski had said from Poland, why don't the Viennese leave? Why don't they go one country back to Germany? One country north, one country removed from the Ottoman invasion. Imagine if people did that. We, whether we like it or not, are going to have to martyr ourselves for this cause, or it will be lost. It's not a pleasant thought, especially for young people such as yourselves, and for people who perhaps have done everything right, so to speak, in their lives. If you've lived a good life and you're hoping to see 80 or 90 or 100, and along comes Simon and he starts saying things like that, it's a bit discouraging. But regrettably, it is our reality. Unless we martyr ourselves, unless we are self-sacrificing. I don't mean martyr ourselves like blow ourselves up with bombs, please, before some idiot passes some ridiculous comment. We are going to have to be self-sacrificing. We're going to have to form communities and bonds and solidarity and act in unison. Direct action by main force, as the expression goes, at our own cost. Solidarity at our own cost. Action at our own cost. And main force, I probably shouldn't say that on the television, on the show. At our own cost.
Yeah. And I've had so many people say to me, like, oh, why don't the white South Africans that are, facing this encroaching genocide, why don't they just come to the United States as refugees? And I tell people, they don't, this is all that they've ever known. The Afrikaners have lived there for hundreds of years. They have prophesied that they are going to, be destroyed there. It's something people can't comprehend, but, if someone posed it to us in the United States, if there was a similar circumstance having us, I don't think I would want to leave the United States either. It's something that, is a part of my family, as it is a part of, white South Africans are, South Africa is a part of them. Yeah,
absolutely. You're right, Enzo. Why should you capitulate to barbarianism? Why? What is the reason? Now you might say, well, to save my own skin, But remember that we come from a culture that is uniquely self-sacrificing. There are very few, if any, other cultures in the world that can claim to have made the selfless sacrifices that ours has. Now you might say, but what about the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Incans and all these guys? They built these tombs and Machu Picchu and what have you. That wasn't self-sacrifice. That was a leader or an authoritarian class dictating that people had to render that service. The people who worked on Chartres Cathedral in France did so knowing they would, the people who not worked on, I beg your pardon, the people who donated tithes for the building of Chartres Cathedral with its famous flying buttresses, which are found in no other civilization in history but yours. Yours. Tithe that money knowing they would never pray in that cathedral. It's not like you and I, unfortunately, we think nowadays we walk into McDonald's, we put our $5 down, we want that damn burger now. But ironically, we don't come from that tradition. Ironically, we come from a contradictory tradition. We come from a tradition which is famous in history and throughout the world for self-sacrifice.
Yeah. And like the sense of like nihilistic consumerism that like engulfs the United States really is something that is used to dissuade us from ever adopting, the values that our ancestors had. They want us to do away with the idea that we have a duty to our next generation to give them a better life than we have. They just straight out say like, they come out with all these articles like, oh, having kids is the worst thing that could ever happen. And, they use this as justifications like, oh, the birth rates in the United States or in Europe are so low, you need immigrants to come and, pay for the entitlements that all the older generations are entitled to. And this is a justification that is used to, replace us.
But the same people, it's the same people saying it, the same people who told you that you're overpopulating the world and you shouldn't have so many children are now telling you that because you're not having children, they must bring people from overseas.
Yeah.
Can people not see this, man? Is it not obvious?
Yeah. And, it just doesn't make sense to me. Why do people feel that foreigners would be entitled to our nation and the future of our nation and have a say in where we get to go as a nation in the future, And I'm not a huge Constitution guy, but I do have a favorite line in it, and it is, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. People forget that the United States is entitled to our posterity. It's not to the posterity of everyone in the world. If we do that, we cease to be America. We cease to have the foundational values that was inscribed to us as a nation in our birth.
And you cease to have the typical characteristics. If you take a glass of milk and you take an eyedropper and you put it in a pot of ink, you take up some ink and you drop a drop of ink in the milk. It doesn't take long before that milk is blue and it doesn't taste like dairy anymore. No offense to the others. I don't wish them ill. I just don't. Maybe that's what I'm doing wrong. Maybe I must start hating black people. Maybe, but I simply do not. But I'd like that milk to remain milk. I would like my children to have the same characteristics and norms and mores and values as I do. I'd like my society to perpetuate those core values. Yes, it's going to change over time. There'll be progress and change and whatever. That's normal. But to just give it all away to outsiders, that they should come and say, well, we don't like the Fifth Amendment. The Sixth is great, but the Fifth, no good. And we should change the Seventh. And maybe the first part of the Constitution, because it doesn't mention Sharia law, and that's not fair on us. What about... It's absurd.
And we're having these conversations in the country right now with, people are coming from nations that are so different than ours, and they see fault with how we have it already. there's no expectation for assimilation anymore whatsoever.
Well, you've got to be mentally retarded, and I say that with kindness. I don't mean to sound cruel. You have to be certifiably mentally retarded not to have seen that was inevitable. If a man is instructed by his God to live in a certain way, and he comes to your country, he's going to continue to live that way because he knows that it's the only way that he's going to see paradise and eternity. He's not going to come to your country and behave the opposite way because some liberal university professor told you that he would. Yeah. That liberal university professor, remember, there's a distinction between the word intelligence and the word intellect, and I'll illustrate it for you very briefly. If you watch a concert, your favorite performer, whoever it is, there are lamps above their heads, lights that shine down, different colors and shapes, and they move around, right? You know these lamps. In the Western world, or in, let's say in Anglophone countries, they are referred to as intelligent lamps. In Russia, they are referred to as intellectual lamps because they're not genuinely intelligent, but they are genuinely intellectual. They do have the capacity to assimilate information and then to express it. Intellectualism is not the same as intelligence. And one of the things that the global elite has done better than anything else in this past few hundred years assault upon us is to ensure that the leading educators in our society, not in Cambodia, but in our society, are not part of the intelligentsia, but that they are intellectuals who regurgitate. They don't discern and they don't discriminate. They regurgitate what they've been told very, very, very well. They are brilliant at it. But they don't necessarily have outstanding IQs. They're not necessarily outstandingly wise people. That's not the characteristic that the global elite needs to pervert your daughters when they go and study sociology and anthropology and all this, these humanities at university. And if people can begin to understand these small little things, they'll do well. It will enable them to appreciate what is occurring. Yeah,
and we're seeing like a strange time between like progressive values and the need for immigration. In this country, the big controversy was immigration. That's pretty much why Donald Trump is the president right now of the United States. People wanted to at least touch on the subject because in the United States, we've had big waves of immigration. We had a great European wave of immigrants, that came in that changed the way that we were. And, people never talk about right after that giant wave, we stopped immigration for decades. We waited for them all to assimilate. And there was no incentives as far as, like, welfare to give to these people. They had to make it on their own. A lot of them went back. Of their own choice. But now, and we changed our immigration laws in, 1965 with the Hart-Celler Act, and we stopped prioritizing Europeans, which would have been, much more assimilable because they're much more similar in values than what was already here. Now we prioritize places that are so juxtaposed to this nation. And you look at where we are since 1965, we're currently sitting at the end of the biggest wave of immigrants we've ever taken in our history. But there's no calls for stopping this for a bit to actually let these people assimilate into the country. Now it's seen as if you want to stop this, you're being racist against the entire world or something. Like, it's a very radical thing, and that they always have the assumption that immigration is just something that is obviously good. But it just makes me wonder. Like, I grew up in places that were 100% white in Wisconsin, and they see that and they say, this place lacks diversity. It's bad. It's wrong. Something about this needs to change. But these places that I lived growing up in, they're great places to live. There's nothing wrong with them.
What's wrong with living with your people? What's wrong with homogenous communities? And just by the way, if people imagine that somehow that is going to be perpetuated by these immigrants, let me tell you that it doesn't work like that. It simply doesn't work like that. They are not going to pick up where you left off and continue to perpetuate what your gene pool and your culture produced. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah. But, like, they point to how, homogenous a lot of places in the United States still is, and they say, this is the reason that we need immigration. This needs to change because I don't know why. They never tell us what is wrong with these places to begin with. They just see it as, this is the assumption that we need to change this.
Well, they're implying that there's something inherently wrong with it. That's the implication.
Yeah.
If they don't give a specific explanation, then the implication is unqualified. There's no rider, no modifier, which means that that thing by its very nature is inferior and wrong. So they're saying your culture, norms, mores, and values is, when it is not diluted, it is wrong and bad. But there's not a single shred of evidence for that contention.
Yeah, and, it's not to say that, like, we can't have immigration, but the thing is, we're not allowed to have any sort of standards for immigration. We're not allowed to, because the United States, real estate-wise, in the world, like, it has high value. We could demand anything for admittance to come to this place. And we would get people that would respond to whatever standard that we put out. But we don't do that. And, because that would be called discrimination. But discriminating gives it value. If you give it to everyone, it no longer has exclusivity. It loses that value. You can see this sort of thing with real estate property in itself, But we don't treat our own nation like that.
No, you don't. And it's very, very sad. It's terribly sad to see. But there is a ray of hope, There's a ray of hope for your American culture, your American ideals, the rich, wonderful facets of what is America, provided that you stand together. If you don't stand together, those of you who hold true to these ancient values, if you don't stand together, you've got no chance at all.
Yeah.
Because they will pick you off one by one by one.
But they're already extremely successful with me and Bobby's generation, the millennial generation. They have polling on the mindset of our generation. About half of our generation sees themselves as citizens of the world. They see it as such an arbitrary thing, like, oh, you didn't choose to be born in America. Why do you think that you have exclusivity to it? They don't see it as, you are part of a continuation of people that have actually struggled to get you to the point to where you live in such a good nation. It wasn't always this nice.
Yeah, gentlemen, I think that there's a lot to speak about, and I think that there will be no shortage of topics and themes for us to discuss over the next, personally, I think the next 14 to 16 months. I think over the next year and a bit, is I suppose what I'm saying, there's going to be a lot of development of these themes. I think that immigration and the resistance to immigration, people standing up for their culture and societies and civilizations is going to become more prominent. If you've seen any of the videos on YouTube and other places of what the young chaps are doing in Identitaire and groups like that in Europe, it's absolutely phenomenal. I think that the politicians are going to push harder and harder to abandon the old ways, both in the USA and in Europe. I think that we've got a front row seat to a very dramatic time in history, and personally, I don't think it's a matter of centuries or decades. I think it's right now the critical phase could be measured in months and handfuls of years.
Yeah. Like, we've just elapsed in the United States like a year since Donald Trump was even elected to be president. And in that span of like the year, the nation is so different, you know, Bobby.
Yeah.
And it's already been extremely like divisive and unique year to like live through the first year of Donald Trump's presidency, but we still have 3 to 7 more years of this to go. And we looked at the 2020 election coming up. It's going to be even hotter than it was for 2016. I can't even imagine what it's going to be like in the country then. But it is unique times, and I do think we need to acknowledge this.
I mean, yeah, like you said, there's the polarization, especially, in the United States alone. And we had a graph that we looked at on the show probably about a month or so ago, to where it used to have like a good bell curve of how people were divided in the country based on politics.
It was.
That's not the case anymore. It's a lot of people on the left, a lot of people on the right, and not many people in the middle anymore.
Yeah.
And
it was polling from Pew Research. It went back just to like 1996, and it looked at it like every 2 years. And you could see like there was a big middle ground in people's political identities. Most people would consider themselves centrist, but just in the short period of time between 1996, which I mean, we were born in 1995, we're very young guys, to where we are now, there is no middle ground. It's only right and left, and it's pushing everyone either way. And, it makes you wonder, like, if we are so hotly divided, why should we continue to be under the same government? We don't get along as a nation anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting times indeed. And sooner or later, it's going to come to a head. I mean, it can't carry on like this.
Indefinitely, no.
Yeah, one side's going to get the upper hand over the other. Time will tell who. But I think that the preponderance of evidence is on your side. Your argument is clearly founded in more facts, figures, data, and truths than the argument of your opponents.
We're not facing arguments anymore. We're just facing numbers. And it's a numbers game. That's why they're so upset about us actually trying to curtail immigration at all. Because they don't want to make arguments to us anymore. They just want other people to vote in our place. That's why they're so crazy about getting amnesty done. Because the second they do that, they've already, flipped Texas. They've already flipped Florida. And once those states are gone, a right-wing person could never win again. It's very scary because, like, this is not a situation that we ever asked for in our lives. It's just something that we find ourselves in.
Boys, you're going to have to step up to the plate, I'm telling you.
Most definitely.
Absolutely.
Anyway, gentlemen, thank you very much for having us. Thanks for the opportunity to get our message out again. We appreciate the support. And I'd just like to say to your viewers, please consider donating to us. Go and have a look at our website. We need money to keep up this fight. We're fighting hard. We're fighting well, but we need support.
Yeah, I know, because we've done 2 episodes about the Suidlanders, the one that we had you on, and then one prior to that. We've gotten probably at least 1,000 people to hear about, the cause of the Suidlanders, and, that's a lot of people just coming from 2 people working on it. So
yes, yeah, keep it up, guys. Keep it up. I really commend people of your generation. As I said to you, the guys in the shield wall. Some exceptions aside, the overwhelming majority of the guys in the shield wall at Charlottesville were youngsters, your age, young. So there really is hope when people of your age, who by rights should be perverts, all things being equal, it doesn't make sense that you've gotten this far and kept your minds,
Yeah.
It gives really cause for hope to see people of your age making meaningful contributions to something that is good and beautiful and true.
Yeah. But, yeah, thank you, Simon, for coming on. I guess we'll have you again sometime in the future to talk about stuff, because we get real deep on it. But it's been pretty good.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you very, very much. And I look forward to coming on again.
Yep. And with
Ask me
Definitely.
anytime.
yeah. And with that, just want to say to the listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of Trump Public Radio, and have a good one. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.